Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning, and we're going to get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's virtual tour of the Timken Museum. We're so excited to have you with us this morning. And a few housekeeping things before we get started. Please keep yourselves muted throughout today's presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to use the Zoom chat function by clicking the button at the bottom of your screen that says chat in order to type your question. We'd be happy to address any questions or comments at the end of today's tour. If you're joining us over from Facebook Live, welcome to you as well. You can also ask any questions you may have using the comment section on Facebook, and we'll be monitoring those comments and answering those questions at the end of the tour as well. Lastly, this tour is being recorded and streamed live and will be posted to our social media channels once the tour is over. If you would like to rewatch this tour or other tours put on by the Timken Museum previously, please check out our YouTube or our Facebook pages to find those. Without further ado, I'm so excited to introduce Eleanor, who will be presenting on Love Letters, 17th Century Dutch Genre Painting. Thank you so much for being with us today, and I'll turn things over to you, Eleanor.
Thank you, Elsie. Well, good morning or good afternoon, and welcome to today's virtual tour of the Timken Museum. My name is Eleanor Merle, and I'm a docent with the museum and delighted to be with you for today's tour of Love Letters, 17th Century Dutch Genre Painting. Just as email now dominates written communication, in the 17th century, the writing of personal letters became widespread and fashionable. Whoops, excuse me. I am sorry. Just one moment, small technical problem. We are set. Although letters had long been used for commercial, military, or state affairs, the notion that they could convey private feelings and emotions suddenly captured the popular imagination and transformed personal communication. For the upwardly mobile citizens of the Dutch Republic's wealthy urban centers, the vogue for letter writing reflected a new level of sophisticated social interaction. Literacy was an especially valuable skill for the citizens of a maritime nation like the Netherlands, since as much as 10% of the male population was at sea or abroad at any given moment in the 17th century. The ability to read and write kept the seafaring traveler far from home in touch with those who remained behind. As such, the Dutch boasted the most literate population in all of Europe. This explosion of epistolary activity was supported by one of Europe's first postal systems. Learning to write letters formed an integral part of early education, and letter writing manuals provided students with hundreds of exemplary letters to use as models for all kinds of situations. Instructions were given on the proper modes of composition, including matters of love, as well as advice on calligraphy and sharpening pens. And 17th century emblem books, which were also immensely popular in the Netherlands, gave great attention to the theme of the love letter, often with Cupid in his role as a harbinger of love. The sheer volume of letter writing in the 17th century can scarcely be exaggerated. The secretary to the Prince of Orange in The Hague, Constantine Huygens, was portrayed in 1627 by Thomas de Keyser in characteristic fashion, handing a letter to a clerk or messenger. It's estimated that Huygens penned 78,000 letters in his lifetime. Many of these naturally had to do with affairs of state, politics, and diplomacy. But Huygens also kept up almost daily writing correspondence with friends and family, as did an increasingly large segment of the population in the Netherlands. I would just ask us to stop for a moment and think about when you last wrote a letter. I can think back, I am old enough to know before email when letters were common, but I have to think awfully hard to the last time I actually wrote a letter as opposed to an email or a message. So back to the 17th century in the Netherlands. Given this background, it then follows that 17th century Dutch artists were the first to make the letter a central theme in images of everyday life, or what we've come to call genre scenes. They became the first to depict anonymous people writing, reading, dispatching, and receiving letters, using them as a pivot on which to turn complex psychological dramas. The Dutch defined the subject and created images that would influence generations of painters to come. Dirk Hals, brother and pupil of the famous portraitist Frans Hals, was probably the first to paint women reading letters. His Seated Woman with a Letter from 1633 shows a lady in a blue jacket and gold skirt sitting on a chair holding a letter. Although we're not privy to the contents of the letter, a maritime painting on the wall behind her suggests that her loved one is far away. But her breaking smile reassures us he's safe and suggests that she's pleased to receive the news contained in the letter she dangles from her hand. The artist who did most to popularize the genre of letter painting was Gerard ter Borch. Among the most highly skilled and influential Dutch painters of the 17th century, his paintings possess a level of beauty and formal refinement which is absent in earlier treatments of the love letter theme. He's also the first letter artist to give his subjects an inner psychological dimension, and we'll take a look at that. Ter Borch painted the earliest surviving genre painting of a woman writing a letter, having previously painted women reading letters. Now, more than a century earlier, the master of the female half-lengths had made a specialty of images of elegantly dressed women seated at a table writing a letter. But she almost always has a covered ointment jar that identifies her as Mary Magdalene. There's no evidence that Ter Borch would have known these images, however. In Ter Borch's Woman Writing a Letter from 1655, we're in a still and quiet interior where a young woman sits at a table concentrating on writing a letter. As the woman bends to her task, the hint of a smile crosses her lips, evoking in her compact and concentrated form the writer's inner life. A curious detail that was noted when the picture was exhibited in 1974 is the fact that the piece of paper is already creased, as if it had been folded. Now, normally one would only fold the letter after it had been written and was about to be sent. But close examination confirms that the writing on the letter continues beneath the point where the quill touches the paper, suggesting that she may have returned to edit the letter or to savor it after it had been composed. A small detail, but one that speaks to the care with which letters were written, read, and reread. Next to her is a softly gleaming pewter inkstand. The demure lady has pushed aside the carpet, which usually covers the table, in order to have a smooth surface on which to write. Curls of fine hair line her delicate face. Her porcelain-covered neck and shoulders emerge from her salmon-colored bodice in a ravishing display of contrasting colors and textures. Note the brilliant red cushion on which she sits. A large pearl dangling seductively from the young woman's hair gets our attention and draws us into the quiet scene. The earring can be interpreted as a symbol of virginity. We see a heavy canopied bed known as a pavilion bed behind her. Now, at this time, beds were often found in living rooms, as private quarters didn't come into use until the end of the 17th century. Thus, the bed here is unlikely to allude to licentious behavior. The pearl, noted as being a sign of virginity, corroborates this. The model for the young blonde lady with pert nose, receding chin, and long, elegant neck reappears often in Ter Borch's genre scenes and was probably his sister, Josina Ter Borch. Here, as so often elsewhere in Dutch genre paintings, we cannot know the content of the letter. Beyond suggesting intimate private surroundings, the elegant setting is not particularly revealing. Given the popularity of love letters in this period, it seems very possible that she's penning or perhaps refining a billet-doux, which perhaps accounts for her concentration and pleased expression. The use of the profile view of the letter writer paradoxically has the effect not of excluding the viewer, but encouraging our lingering consideration of her form and state of mind. Gerard Ter Borch was born to a family of painters in Zwolle in 1617. He trained in Haarlem and then in London with an uncle who was an engraver, before traveling and painting throughout Europe. By the early 1640s, he had perfected a new type of small, full-length portrait and remained throughout his career one of the most sought-after portrait painters of his era. Among the greatest Dutch masters of the 17th century, Ter Borch was the most influential genre painter of the latter half of the 17th century, and in some fashion touched the art of virtually every Dutch figure painter, as well as numerous 18th and even 19th century European and American artists. This painting, with such a minimal scene, certainly was an example for other artists like Vermeer, and we'll be taking a look at Vermeer's work shortly. Now, among Ter Borch's innovations were paired pendant paintings. He pioneered these paired compositions, often with male writers and female readers. Let's take a look at one of these pendants. In An Officer Writing a Letter with a Trumpeter from 1658 to 59, Gerard Ter Borch situates the quiet, reflective activity of letter writing in the traditionally boisterous environment of the guard room. An officer sits at a table and composes a letter as a trumpeter, who will act as a messenger, stands respectfully with hat in hand to the left. A slender, white spotted hound sniffs the courier in the background, and in the background is a pavilion bed. On the right wall stands a tall hearth, and resting on the mantel above, a small vial of liquid and powder horn. The officer wears a gold jacket, gray trousers, and a cuirass, or kind of armor plate. He's placed not in profile, but seated directly in front of the viewer at an oak table with a red cover. Before him is a piece of paper, tiny inkwell, writing utensils, and red sealing wax. The trumpeter wears a blue and black striped tabard over a light tan coat and white cravat, and holds a tan hat. A long trumpet with tassel is slung over his shoulder by a yellow sash. The end of his sword is just visible, hanging down beneath the trumpet, suggesting the possibility of violence on his routes. The trumpeter, who glances out of the corner of his eye at the viewer, apparently waits for the officer to finish the letter. Completing the trumpeter's outfit are thigh-high leather boots with spurs, indicating that he's arrived by horseback, hence capable of delivering express messages. The trumpeter was the military's official messenger and courier. Now, card playing was a favorite activity of lovers, and the ace of hearts on the floor in the foreground suggests that the letter being written is an amorous one. In other words, the officer addresses the recipient from the heart. The shards of clay pipes scattered around the card refer both to merrymaking activities usual in such a room and to frustrations the letter writer is having in expressing his romantic feelings. In the case of this work, we can be fairly certain that the officer's intended is the lady in the fur-trimmed jacket in a work called Woman Sealing a Letter with a Maidservant, painted during the same period. It's complementary in both theme and design, and the two works were likely the first pendants to link a man and a woman through the theme of a shared letter. So here in this work, we see a spare but elegant interior, and a woman sits at a table sealing a letter with wax as a maidservant of perhaps 15 or 16 years old waits to one side holding a marketing pail. Wearing a dark plum-colored jacket trimmed with plump white fur, a white cap, and a tawny silk skirt, the lady heats the sealing wax in the open flame of a candle. With the carefully composed design, the brilliant red accent of the stick of wax appears at the very epicenter of the composition. Before the lady on the table is an inkstand, a tall silver candlestick, a piece of paper, and a small red book. At her feet on the floor is a small brown and white spaniel, while behind her is a tall hearth with a cloth valance and a mantle surmounted by several small objects. Note that the hound, suitable to the male world, is juxtaposed with the lady's daintier lapdog. Since one must presume that the content of the letters penned by the man and sealed by the woman center on love, it's worth observing the possibility that the small red volume on the table is a love letter manual. It's approximately the same width and size as the 1644 and 45 editions of Jean Puget de la Serre's manual entitled Le Secrétaire à la Mode, and this was a well-known letter writing manual of the time. Terborch's paired paintings provide important precedents for Gabriel Metsu's pendants. Although Metsu began his career as a painter of religious subjects, he became one of the most accomplished specialists of depictions of daily life in his time. He made no fewer than 9 images of men or women reading or writing love letters from the late 1650s to the mid-1660s. The Timken is privileged to have one of his pendant paintings entitled A Lady Receiving a Letter from 1658. At a mere 10 1/8 by 9 5/8 inches, A Lady Receiving a Letter by Metsu holds the distinction of being the smallest painting on display in the Timken galleries. It's one of the purest and most delicious examples of Dutch genre painting at its height in the late 1650s and early 1660s, according to Franklin Robinson, a leading scholar of Metsu's work. The work dates to the last decade of Gabriel Metsu's life, during which he focused increasingly on subjects drawn from everyday life. What we see here is a young woman in a gray-green skirt, red jacket, white collar and hood, and she sits with an open book on her lap before a stone table. A messenger dressed in a rusty brown coat and trousers doffs his hat deferentially and delivers a letter to the lady, who seems to have interrupted her reading. The suggestion of a smile crosses her lips. What distinguishes the painting is that it captures the precise moment of a letter being delivered into the hand of its recipient. The white letter clasped gently by both the messenger and the expected woman. Barely discernible on the letter is the word Juffrouw, Dutch word, a form of address indicating that the young woman is unmarried. On the table to the left is a stone urn with a prominent red poppy and other flowers. The suggestion of an elegant garden setting is introduced by the arches of an open arcade at the back and a glimpse of a grand Palladian villa in the distance. Even soft daylight suffuses the scene and brings out the strong colors of the subtly harmonized palette. Now, as the identity of the letter writer, art historians are quite certain that the gentleman in another Metsu painting, virtually the same size, entitled A Man Writing a Letter, now in the collection of the Musée Fabre Montpellier in France, is the man in question. In this painting, Metsu depicts a man seated at a table, drafting what might well be the letter that appears in our painting. To his right, a female servant holding a candle illuminates the dark scene. The expression on the letter's face is intense. He seems not to mind the clutter around him. We sense his earnestness and that he's lost in his thoughts while he crafts the sentiments that will soon be read by his beloved. In both works, the careful observation of minute details of everyday life is typical of the artist. According to Frank Robinson, who we mentioned was a Metsu scholar, Metsu represented himself as the man in the Montpellier painting, and his wife, Isabella, was the model for the woman in the Timken painting. The figures' likenesses are known from several portraits, including these pendants in the Speed Museum in Louisville. The resemblance to the writer's long nose, full face, receding hairline, and long curly hair is notable. If we assume that the two primary figures in the scene are Metsu and Isabella, it's conceivable that the pair were painted just before their marriage in April of 1658, a date which is consistent with the style of the paintings. Some persuasive evidence supports the assumption that the two works are pendant paintings. They appeared as a pair in 3 separate sales in 1814, 15, and 18. Furthermore, their complementary 3/4-length format support the assumption that Metsu conceived them as pendants.
Right there. We don't have anything here, so we'll need a piece of wood.
Thank you. Metsu conceived them as pendants or companion pieces. A close review of the two pictures show that both desks are at the same level and both of the individual's hands are in essentially the same position. Also, there's a second person in each picture. When man writing a letter and a lady receiving a letter were first created, they were understood to be in deep dialogue with one another. The two works might have been arranged on a single wall, a few feet between them at most, as they signaled their interest in sharing thoughts across time and space. Now, the two works are separated by oceans. Their messages, while unknown, seem full of purpose and strive to connect us still. Gabriel Metsu was born to the Flemish painter Jacques Metsu, and he spent a good portion of his life in Leiden, where he was a member of the Painting Guild. He left after a scandal involving his visit to a brothel, and it was believed that he'd quit painting, but this isn't the case, as several of his works surfaced after his leaving the guild. We see Metsu in this self-portrait with his arm leaning casually over the back of his chair and his gaze directed out toward the viewer. He used his self-portrait to display his own self-confidence. His wife, on the other hand, appears serene and self-contained. Dutch portrait artists were praised for their ability to communicate a sense of their sitters' personalities. While Metsu's portrait conveys the swagger of the successful artist, that of his wife emphasizes the ideal of feminine reserve. Metsu returned to the letter theme triumphantly about 5 to 7 years later in his masterpiece pendants done between 1665 and 1667. They are Metsu's most famous works, and they belong to the finest Dutch genre paintings produced in the 17th century. Both pictures reveal the influence of Johann Vermeer, whose work Metsu may have known through a visit to Vermeer's workshop in Delft, or more likely from seeing them at the house of Pieter Claes van Ryven, a local collector who probably owned up to 20 paintings by Vermeer. In Woman Reading a Letter with a Maidservant, a woman sitting on a little platform is engrossed in reading a letter she's just received from her suitor. Wearing a white cap, an elegant yellow fur-trimmed jacket, and peach silk skirt, she evidently has interrupted her needlework. A lovely blue and red sewing pillow rests in her lap. A sewing basket appears at her side, and on the tile floor in the lower right is an errant thimble. She's kicked off a slipper that appears in the foreground, probably to place her bare foot on the foot warmer that resides unseen under her skirt. She holds the letter at an angle, not only because she may need more light to read it, but also because she wants to hide the contents from her maid. Yet her servant at the back right, standing with her back to the viewer, already knows what the letter is about. She reveals a warning for her mistress by pulling aside a curtain protecting a painting of a ship sailing on choppy waters. The painting of the seascape on the back wall alludes symbolically to the fact that her male correspondent is separated from her by a sea voyage. The seascape is also a scene of choppy seas. Indeed, it's been suggested that they alluded to the idea that, and I quote, "Love is as fickle as the sea." The maidservant holds a letter in her left hand addressed to the artist. Hence, not, as has sometimes been assumed, the envelope in which the letter came that the lady reads. This letter isn't part of the narrative, but constitutes Metsu's humorous way of signing his work. A small mirror in another black frame and surmounted with a ribbon also appears on the whitewashed back wall. A small lapdog rests its front paws on the platform and looks at the maidservant. Now, Metsu had originally intended the lady's fur-trimmed jacket to be red, but he painted it yellow at a later stage. And if you were to see this painting live, you can actually see the red paint with the naked eye. He made the change knowing that yellow jackets were one of Vermeer's trademarks. The lady's costly fabrics, the large curtain painting, or what's probably an expensive ebony frame, the delicately wrought chair at the right, not to mention the maidservant and lapdog, indicate that this is a well-to-do household. Let's now turn to the pendant work where we see a man writing a letter. So here we have a gentleman elegantly attired in black silk and ample white linen collar and sleeves, and he sits with his ankles crossed, writing a letter at a table with a quill pen. His beribboned black hat hangs on the back of the red upholstered chair. Before him, on the table, are a silver inkwell and a wafer stamp. The table is covered with a sumptuous Persian carpet with a red field and blue border with fringe. The leaded glass window in the left wall is open to admit the air and clear silver light. Seen through the open window and resting on the table is a globe. The man's elegant attire and the Persian carpet on the table suggest that he's well-to-do. The globe behind the window underscores his erudition. On the whitewashed wall is a pastoral Italianate landscape with sheep and goats in a lovely carved and gilt frame with lobed decorations and surmounted by a dove. Birds also figure on the line of blue and white tiles at the base of the wall. The floor is composed of black and white marble in a diamond pattern. Now, throughout the recorded history, these two paintings have always appeared together as a pair, being sold and exhibited together. Depicting a man writing a letter and a woman reading a letter, they create a pictorial dialogue that underscores the reciprocal nature of the theme. Now, whereas in the Timken and Montpellier paintings, the sender and recipient face each other in half-length compositions, here the designs are subtler, with the man turning his back to the woman as he concentrates on his writing, while she leans toward him and the light. Now, no exhibition of 17th century Dutch painting that deals with the theme of letters would be complete without a painting by Johan Vermeer. Of the 34 known paintings attributed to the Delft master, 6 depict well-to-do women reading or writing, so he was clearly taken with the theme. Of course, it's the mystery of Vermeer's writers and readers that makes them so captivating. And in that sense, Woman in Blue reading a letter from 1663 and 4 stands out as an enigmatic pinnacle. Here is a woman dimmed by shadows, and she stands motionless at a table in a bare room reading a letter, possibly a message from a lover, wrapped by the words which she pulls close to her body. On the table, a second page of the letter partially covers a string of pearls on a blue ribbon, perhaps just removed from the open jewelry box. She seems to have risen from her chair abruptly because her pearls still rest on the table. Her mouth is slightly agape. She's still wearing her blue night jacket. All of the colors in the composition are secondary to its radiant lapis lazuli blue. Soft morning light from an unseen window highlights her forehead and glances across the delicate fabric of the jacket, but leaves the bow around the side curl of her hair and the back of her form in deep shadow. We cannot see the contents of the letter, and there are a few clues as to its significance. Now, the choice of the phosphorescent blue imbuing the figure does imbue it with a celestial floating quality. Blue, as you probably know, was Vermeer's favorite color, and it was incredibly expensive. Ground from lapis lazuli stones and imported from Afghanistan, blue was typically reserved for special occasions and often was used explicitly for depictions of the Holy Virgin Mary. Being so expensive, lapis lazuli was used in tiny amounts to create a distinctive pigment for most of Vermeer's works. He was known for being the only artist in the 17th century to have used the ultramarine shade on such a large scale. Now, one question has often centered on whether or not the central figure happens to be pregnant. Despite her appearance, and in part because depictions of pregnancy were rare at the time, some have suggested that Our Lady in Blue is simply wearing the fashions of the times, a voluminous housecoat with thick skirts worn underneath. Now let's focus for a moment on the large muted wall map of Holland that occupies much of the upper right of the composition and has elicited numerous interpretations. Some have suggested that it may allude to the author of the letter, perhaps a husband away on a journey or an absent lover. But the map might have more practical implications. Decorative wall maps were a popular fixture of Dutch interiors during the 17th century, and most often in paintings, they were included simply to add some compositional drama to otherwise empty walls. The same map appears in another of Vermeer's works, and you can see it more clearly here. And this is the earlier work called Officer and Laughing Girl from 1657. The artist renders the wall map behind the couple with such clarity that it can be identified as a map of Holland and West Friesland, pictured with a west-up orientation, in which the blue areas indicate land and not water. The map evokes the great age of Dutch exploration and commerce during Vermeer's life. It's very possible that the map was in Vermeer's possession. Vermeer ran a shop from his home, and the demand for maps at the time was extremely high. Vermeer borrowed heavily from his fellow Dutchman, the artist Gerard ter Borch, who, as we discussed previously, was famed in his lifetime for his innovative genre scenes. In fact, it was ter Borch who first painted the contemplative scenes of well-to-do young ladies lost in thought, for which Vermeer is today so famed. In the case of A Woman in Blue reading a letter, Vermeer has plucked the central figure's blue top and open mouth from ter Borch's work entitled The Letter from a few years earlier. But Vermeer was not alone in his liberal borrowing from the compositions of others. Successful motifs were frequently synthesized into compositions by other artists. What interested 17th century collectors was not necessarily who painted something first, so much as who painted something best. As an aside, take note of ter Borch's depiction of the woman's magnificent satin dress. No one captured the texture and feel of satin better than ter Borch. Johann Vermeer became a master in St. Luke's Guild of Delft in December 1653. At that time, he specialized in history painting, and his first works were large-scale mythological and religious paintings. Shortly thereafter, he began to paint the genre scenes, landscapes, and allegories for which he's become so renowned. Even though Vermeer's subject matter changed in the mid-1650s, he continued to imbue his later works with the quiet, intimate moods he'd preferred in his early history paintings. Woman in Blue reading a letter epitomizes the directness and quiet grandeur of his approach at mid-career. I'd like to close our discussion today with two works, one by Vermeer, one by Metsu, both of which introduced a new pose for the letter writer. The first of the two works is by Gabriele Metsu and is entitled Elegant Lady Writing at Her Desk, and it was done between 1662 and 1664. While the subject of a woman writing a letter had been first popularized by Gerard ter Borch, as we saw in our first discussed work, he and the other artists whom he influenced never depicted the woman looking out directly at the viewer. Here is a lady in a black fur trimmed jacket, brownish skirt, jeweled earrings, and she's paused from writing a letter to look at the viewer in a friendly fashion, with a slight smile crossing her face. Poised to resume writing as soon as the interruption has passed, she sits with her right hand holding her quill pen above an inkwell, resting on the tapestry-covered table before her. Adding to the momentary character of the scene is the inquisitive small brown and white dog by the woman's table, who peers toward the table while balancing expectantly on one paw. Although the content of the letter, as we know, was not known, it's undoubtedly amorous in nature, because this is the case with virtually all Dutch 17th century genre letter writing images. Images of ships at sea appear with some frequency in the background of such works, as we've discussed, evoking the traditional notion that love is as changeable as the sea. A calm sea, evident in this seascape, was considered a good omen for the relationship between the two lovers. The use of curtains, like the one that serves to protect the painting in the background, was a common practice of the day. With the rapid expansion of foreign trade in the Netherlands, colorful Oriental carpets became very popular in the 16th and particularly 17th century as decorative objects laid on tables or chests. And we saw Metsu's use of similar Persian carpets with a red field, blue border, and fringe in his two Man Writing a Letter paintings we discussed earlier. He was fond of the usage of Oriental rugs, and it's believed that in at least 13 works, he placed a rug somewhere in the picture. Metsu here placed the letter writer in front of a white and red marble mantelpiece comprising Corinthian columns and an elaborately carved frieze, which is based on a chimney piece in Amsterdam's town hall. Many of Metsu's genre scenes painted during the last few years of his life depict women whose facial figures are based in various degrees on those of his wife. And we saw that in the Timken work. And his wife, Isabella de Wolf, an elegant lady writing at her desk, this is an exception. In this work, the woman's pronounced eyelids, broad nose bridge are not those of the artist's spouse. Her features are so distinctive that it's probable that the painting is a portrait of a woman posing as a letter writer. The ring on her finger may indicate she's married. About 2 to 4 years after Metsu completed Elegant Lady writing at her desk, Vermeer also painted an attractive letter-writing woman smiling subtly at the viewer. Although the works differ in many respects, the paintings share the portrait-like character of the women, who differ from the other figure types in the rest of the artist's works. It remains undetermined whether these similarities are the result of the two artists independently transforming ter Borch's images in the same way, or whether the Delft painter knew Metsu's painting, which was probably part of a collection in Amsterdam. This work from about 1665 is entitled A Lady Writing. The woman is viewed 3/4 length, seated at a desk in a shadowed interior, writing a letter. She wears a luxurious lemon yellow morning jacket trimmed with spotted white fur, pearl earrings, and yellow and white ribbons in her hair. Remember, we said earlier that ter Borch had changed one of his images of a woman to be wearing a yellow jacket like Vermeer. The soft light falling from the upper left illuminates her with a smoky cast. In her right hand, she holds a quill pen that is still applied to the paper, while she rests her other arm on the table as if she only has just been diverted from her writing. The elegant author turns her attention from the letter that she writes, and she looks out momentarily at the viewer. A hint of a smile crosses her lips. She sits in a straight-back chair with leather upholstery and a lion's head finish. This table is covered with a slate blue cloth, not a rug, which has rare objects on it: a small silver-studded wooden box, a silver inkwell, and a string of pearls extended across the table with a yellow silk ribbon. On the plaster wall in the distance is a barely discernible painting in an ebony frame depicting a still life, which included a foreshortened bass viola. The woman has more individualized features than some of Vermeer's models, and it's been sometimes speculated that she could portray the artist's wife, Katerina Bowles, who, having been born in 1631, would have been an appropriate age, in her early to mid-30s, if this work was painted as customarily dated in the mid-1660s. Unfortunately, there are no surviving images of Katerina, so there's really no proof. So very quickly here, I wanted to show you that there are two other Vermeer works, Woman Wearing a Pearl Necklace and The Love Letter. And he uses the same compositional, in the love letter, he uses the same compositional arrangement for Woman with a Pearl Necklace that he uses in Woman in Blue reading a letter. And the picture is probably the painting representing a woman wearing a necklace, which was in Katerina Bowles' bedroom at the time of Vermeer's death. The artist seems to have kept only 4 of his own pictures. And this suggests that this picture had a special importance. In the love letter, which acquired this name in the early 19th century, an elegantly dressed woman looks up expectantly at a maidservant who just handed her a letter. And the seascape on the wall, again, may allude to the epistle's subject, that the sea often being compared to love and the lover to a ship. In closing, I'd like to share with you a bit of postal trivia that's rather exciting. In a world first for the study of historic documents, an unopened letter written in 1697 has been read by researchers without breaking the seal. They used X-ray microtomography scans of the letter to accomplish this feat. This is a letter dated July 31st, 1697, and it's sent from a French merchant in Lille to his cousin in The Hague. And it's been closed using letter locking, a process in which the letter is folded to become its own envelope, keeping it very private. It's part of a collection of some 2,600 undelivered letters sent from all over Europe to The Hague between 1689 and 1706, 600 of which have never been opened. They were preserved by the chief postmasters of The Hague and donated to the Postal Museum in 1926. Now, differently, when letters couldn't be delivered in the 17th and 18th century, they were held on to by employees because the recipient, rather than the sender, paid for a letter. So undelivered letters could be worth something if someone came to claim them. One woman wrote, enclosing a cutout paper dove holding a flaming heart, bitterly recalling, and I quote, "the fidelity which you promised me and which I have given with all my soul. Whoever the faithless lover was, he never got the letter." This brings our tour to a close. I hope you enjoyed the virtual journey of 17th century genre painting depicting love letters. I welcome any questions or comments you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eleanor, for such a wonderful tour. And yes, we'd be happy to take any questions or comments. Okay, so before you go, I would like to remind everybody that this tour and other tours put on previously through the Timken Museum can be found on our social media channels, our Facebook and YouTube page. And if you'd like further info on future tours being put on by the museum, please check out our website events calendar for those details. And thank you again for joining us this morning. And thank you, Eleanor, for such a wonderful, rich tour. And goodbye, everybody. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
It was great, really good.